Please could we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening.
Hi everybody, this is John here. This is Paul, George
and Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your programme once again.
Hello everyone, this is Steve Marinucci, and I'm really happy to welcome Debbie Greenberg, the author of Cavern Club, The Inside Story. Debbie, welcome.
Thank you, Steve.
Today is a very good day to be doing this because we're recording this on February 9th, which everybody in America knows is the anniversary of the Ed Sullivan Show. But February 9th, 1961 was the first day that the Beatles played the Cavern. And you saw them many times. In fact, you saw them every time they played.
That's correct. All 292 times.
So you would have seen them on this date in 61. Do you remember anything about that show?
The Beatles had been advertised as the Beatles direct from Hamburg. We were expecting a German group when they arrived. They'd played at Litherland Town Hall, which is a suburb of Liverpool in the north of Liverpool, in late December. And we were expecting to see these German guys coming. By all accounts, they'd played an incendiary performance at Litherland. We were excited to see them. And of course, when they came, they were Scousers, they were Liverpudlians, which was fabulous for us. They were local lads. So they went into the band room and then they got onto the stage and they just exploded into their music. And they were loud, they were exciting, the energy was palpable. Right from the second they started to play, I just knew they were different. I went home to my father that night and I said, Dad, I've just seen a group on the Cavern called the Beatles, and you mark my words, they're going to be famous one day. You just knew it.
And that was with Pete Best.
Yes.
What did you remember about Pete Best's drumming? Were you happy with Pete's drumming at the time? Did you think he was good for them?
To be truthful, Steve, we didn't know any different because we, as laymen, we didn't understand the technicalities of drumming. So to us, the drumming seemed fine.
Your book is amazing in that it's really gritty.
Thanks.
And it starts before the Beatles even come into the picture. It even shows an interesting picture of Liverpool life at the time. Do you remember anything about, those early days and what it was like?
Liverpool was emerging from World War II as we were growing up, and it was pretty grey and depressed at the time in the 50s. And there were bomb sites peppered all over Liverpool from the Blitz, from the May Blitz of 41. But we made our own entertainment. There was no media, there was no television. We entertained ourselves. And I think that the biggest impact of all was the music. When we heard Elvis for the first time singing Heartbreak Hotel in 56, then we were excited. And then, of course, we got Buddy Holly and Cliff Richard and Gene Vincent and all the others that came afterwards. So music was the thing that inspired us and made us eager for change after coming out of such a depressed city at the time. And so the first time I experienced live music in Liverpool, I went to the Cavern Club with a friend of mine who was a few years older than me. So she took me down there, and it was a jazz club at the time. And I didn't go there until 1959. Now, Alan Sitner was the guy who had opened the Cavern Club on the 16th of January, 1957. And he was a jazz enthusiast. And he'd seen this cellar club in Paris on the left bank called Le Caveau. And he was eager to replicate it in Liverpool. And he came back to Liverpool and he was having a drink in Matthew Street in the pub called The Grapes, which is now famous. And he was chatting with a couple of friends of his and explaining what he wanted to do. And as they were walking up Matthew Street on the way out, there was a sign over one of the warehouses on the left, lease for sale. And so one of the guys with him said, why don't you make inquiries about that? That looks ideal, which he did, and it was. And consequently, the Cavern opened its doors on the 16th of Jan 57. It was 3 tunnels, and he put a stage at one end, a band room to the left and a cloakroom to the right. And there we had the birth of the Cavern.
And it pretty much stayed the same or stayed that way until your father took ownership, correct?
Correct.
And the description you have of the cavern when you first walked in really was astonishing because you really had to persevere to get through an evening there. Didn't have a lot of modern conveniences. They didn't have air conditioning. In fact, they didn't even have fans.
Correct.
It was astonishing to read in the book what you had to go through every time there were bugs. Was there mice too?
Probably, yes. I think all those city warehouses had mice or rats running around at some stage. Well, we didn't see any of them. But yes, it was such a special place, the Cavern. When I first went to the Cavern, it was a jazz club in 1959. And it had a lovely feeling about it. You felt safe down there. It had a familiar feeling. And although jazz wasn't particularly my kind of music, it was a lovely place to go to. And so we went 1959, and then in 1960 there was a change in the music in the Cavern. Ray McFall bought the club from Alan Sitner because Alan became disillusioned with the Cavern because skiffle was infiltrating. And of course, one of the skiffle groups was the Quarrymen in 1957 in the August. And John Lennon, cheeky as he was, he would slip in a rock and roll number in the middle of a song or a session. And Alan didn't like it. He'd send a note to the stage. The note went to John. He read it, and that's what it said: cut out the rock. So Alan was disillusioned because he didn't want the skiffle. And Ray McFall used to work for Alan Sitner's father's accountancy firm. And so he would often step in on the desk, the pay desk for them when they were busy. And so he was the ideal candidate to become the next owner of the Cavern, which he did in October of 59. Now, Ray was also a jazz enthusiast, but it didn't take Ray long to realize that what the kids wanted was rock and roll. And so in 1960, we had a combination right through the year of jazz, skiffle, and rock and roll. And then, of course, after 1960, 61, rock and roll really took off big time at the Cavern.
If I can ask, who did you see before the Cavern went to rock and roll? Who were some of the jazz and skiffle acts? Lonnie Donegan would have been one of them, correct?
Absolutely, yes. I saw Lonnie Donegan at the Cavern. The Mississippi Jazz Band were the first ones to play at the Cavern when Alan opened it. But I saw Chris Barber, Acker Bilk, and a good few others of the big names of jazz, and little skiffle groups. Eddie Clayton's skiffle played, but we didn't see that. That was in 57. Coincidentally, Ringo was part of that group. And Ringo was the first Beatle to play the Cavern on the 31st of July, 1957, followed a week later by the Quarrymen with John Lennon in it on the 7th of August. He joined Rory a good time later after that.
The Quarrymen debuted in the Cavern a week later than Ringo, but they didn't have Paul.
No.
The Quarrymen were really rough.
They were a skiffle group, predominantly a skiffle to begin with.
Okay.
But it was when Paul met John at the Garden Fete in Woolton Village on the 6th of July, 57. He played 20 Flight Rock to John, and he had to tune the guitar because it was in banjo mode because his mother Julia had tuned it. And so John was really taken with Paul, but he didn't want him to know that at that stage. A week or so later, he sent Pete Shotton, who was also one of the Quarrymen, round to see Paul to ask him or to tell him, John will have you in the group if you're interested. And that's what happened. But Paul and his brother Mike were going off to Derbyshire for a holiday, so they couldn't join right away. So that they joined in the October of 57. But Paul played for the first time with the Quarrymen in early 1958 at the Cavern.
Did you see the magic that early between the two of them? Was it really apparent, or was Paul learning from John at that stage?
No, they were still at the Quarrymen stage in 1958. The chemistry between John and Paul was very noticeable when they were the Beatles.
You talk about Bob Buller's nightly introductions and using Bobby Darin's "I'll Be There." Did he switch over to Jerry Marsden and the Jerry and the Pacemakers version later on when
No,
he didn't?
no,
Ah,
it was always Bobby Darin.
it was always Bobby Darin. Interesting. That is surprising because Jerry Marsden's is a great version. Let's talk about the firing of Pete Best. You said that came as a total surprise to you and to everybody. Were you one of those who wanted to keep Pete, or did you prefer Ringo?
We wanted to keep Pete. He was a very good looking guy. He had a very big following of girls. And it was a shock. Pete was summoned into Brian's office at NEMS, and Brian said, "The boys want you out," which was a huge shock for Pete. He thought he was going in for a regular talk with Brian. He said, "I can sort you out with the Mersey Beats if that's any good." Or Pete said, "No, leave it with me." Because he said Johnny Hutch is covering. Johnny Hutch was the drummer for the Big Three, the group, the Big Three. He was covering for the days that they had gigs for in between. And he said Ringo was joining them on Saturday on the 18th of August. Poor Pete didn't know what was happening. It was being hit like an express train. And so he went off the circuit for quite a long time, which is understandable. So then on the 18th of August, Ringo made his debut with the Beatles at Hume Hall at Port Sunlight on the Wirral, which is the peninsula facing the River Mersey, facing Liverpool. And the following night, he made his debut with the Beatles at the Cavern. Now, we all knew Richie, or I knew him as Richie, but we knew him as Ringo from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes because we saw them regularly as well. So when he appeared on the stage in place of Pete, we just couldn't understand it. What's happened? Where's Pete? Is he not? What's the matter? And word filtered through that Ringo had replaced Pete. So we all started to chant, and I was one of them. "Pete forever, Ringo never." And we were chanting. We had to quieten down eventually. And somebody gave George Harrison a black eye because it filtered through that George had been the instigator of the swap between Pete Best and Ringo. So it was a very eventful night. But we had to accept the fact that Ringo was now on the drums and Pete wasn't. And we just had to accept it.
There was no explanation from the stage.
No, and as I said before, the drumming didn't sound any different to us. And then a couple of days later, on the 22nd of August, the Beatles were filmed at the Cavern by Granada Television. And I was there, and it was baking hot. It was like a sauna most times anyway in the Cavern, but it was exceptionally hot this particular day. And we were right at the back of the central aisle under all the floodlights. And you could still hear people shouting on the video, "Pete forever." It was still ripe then, even in those few days. It was a shock for everybody.
Did they lose any fans from that? Because I know the reaction in Liverpool was pretty strong. A lot of fans really liked him. Did they lose any fans from that you know of then?
I don't think they did, Steve, to be honest.
Hmm.
The general consensus was it's the Beatles and they're still playing the music we love. And we still had the antics between Paul and John on the stage, and didn't take George long to catch up as well. So, yeah, we had to accept it. It was so sad for Pete and for us, for everybody.
What did Paul and John do on stage?
They had quick banter between one another, and their chemistry was very good. Have wisecracks and jokes, and they'd have cups of tea on the stage and bread rolls and a bite in between. It was so familiar. It was like a private party every time they played. It wasn't like going to a gig today. The stage was less than 2 feet high. The first row of seats was less than 2 feet away. You could practically touch them on stage. You could interact with them and ask them for requests. And they were good at interacting, especially Paul. Even today, you see how Paul drags the audience into his show.
Right.
He's a past master at that. And they were always cracking jokes and making quips. And there were four vocalists in the Beatles. And I think that was the ingredient that made them so special, because every one of them had a fabulous voice. They could all sing. It's normal to have a front vocal and then the accompaniment behind, but they were very special. And when sometimes Pete would come out and sing Peppermint Twist or Kansas City, and then Paul would get on the drums while he was singing. So they were a very versatile group, but they oozed excitement. They were loud, they were extremely loud, and their energy was palpable, and their harmonies were wonderful. And the music was so diverse. They'd play rock and roll, Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and then Paul would sing Besame Mucho, and John would sing Anna. And so we got a mixture. They could have sung the Telephone Directory and we'd have been thrilled with this. But that's how we knew them, and because they were raw. And the Beatles that hit America in '64 were not the Beatles that we knew. We were privileged to know them right from day one, from the beginning. And they were raw and they were exciting and they were naughty. They were naughty with each other. They were fabulous. We couldn't get enough of them.
They were still in the leather jackets in that time. They did not go to the suits until later.
Correct. When they arrived at the Cavern for the first time on the 9th of February, '61, leather jackets with black jumpers or T-shirts underneath and ordinary trousers, black trousers. Now, that was in the February. Now, Stu wasn't with them then. Stu had stayed behind in Hamburg to be with Astrid. So he didn't actually arrive for the debut on the 9th of February. He didn't come into the Cavern until the 21st of February. And then at the end of March, the 5 of them all went back to Hamburg. And they stayed there then till July. So when they came back in the July, that's when they had all the leathers from top to toe, leather jackets, leather trousers, Cuban heel boots. That's when we got the full leather gear.
Did you ever talk to them about the switch over to the suits and how they felt about it?
No, we didn't get the opportunity to have a personal conversation with them. It was all so fast. They'd sing a number and they'd go straight into another number, and then they'd go in the band room for the interval, and then they'd come for a second set, and then they'd be off. They'd be carrying their gear out of the Cavern, and you could have a hello and yes, that was great, or that, just a minimal conversation with them. So we didn't get the opportunity to have a personal rapport with them.
How did they get out of the Cavern without getting crushed by the fans?
Because we knew who they were, local lads to us. They were, although they were fantastic, they were our Beatles. They were one of us.
You knew some of their families. Talk about their family life. Both Ringo and George were very close to their parents.
Yes. Ringo, or Richie as I knew him, my parents owned butcher's shops. We had a butcher's shop in North Hill Street, which was diagonally opposite to Admiral Grove, where Richie lived. And his mother, Elsie, a lovely lady, she would come in on a Saturday morning, pop a 10-shilling note on the counter and say, "The usual, Deb, our Richie will be in later to collect it." And I'd say, okay. And I'd get the order ready for him. And it was always the same every week, half a leg of lamb and a quarter of boiled ham. And he was so shy, he would come and stand in the doorway of our butcher's shop. And I'd have to say to him, "Have you come for your mum's meat, Rich?" And he'd just nod. And I'd have to take the parcel and the change over to him, and he'd walk over the road to Admiral Grove. And sometimes my father used to treat our butcher's boys to a round of drinks on a Saturday night after close of play. And there was a little pub on the corner of Admiral Grove and Lothian Street, and it was called the Lothian Pub. And we'd go into the little snug. You'd go round ignore the first doorway, and you'd go round the side street, and there was a little door on the left, and that was the snug at the back, and that's the way we always used to go in. And Richie would often be in that little snug, and my dad would sometimes say to him, "Are you having a drink, Rich?" And he'd say, "Okay, I'll have a half." And that was half a pint. So that was our relationship with Richie and his mum, Elsie. George Harrison, we lived in Lane in Woolton. We were in number 147, and the Harrisons moved into number 174. Ford's factory had built a huge amount of houses. I don't know whether Ford's actually covered it, but the council built a huge amount of council properties, and they moved into one of them, and that was 174 Mackett's Lane. And My mother and Louis, used to walk up a little road called Rosefield Road to get the bus at the terminus. And they'd get on the bus together and they'd often walk down the road and chat to one another. And one particular day when the Beatles had started to make it big, they were at home and George's green Jag was outside the house this particular night. They were coming to the Cavern. And I came home from the butcher's shop early and said to my mother, the lads are back. Ask Louis if you can get me some autographs. So my mother went over and saw her. And when she opened the door to the house, if you looked up the stairs, there was a life-size picture of George at the top of the stairs. And that was visible when the front door was open. And so she said, yes, sure, leave it with me, Laura. I'll ask George when he comes back. We'll sort it out. And they did 4 postcards for me, each with each quarter had one of each of the faces on. And they signed 4 for me. And foolishly, I sent them to friends of mine across the globe.
Oh my.
2 to America, 1 to Australia, and 1 to Canada. I didn't keep one.
Oh no.
Well, I thought I can see them. I'm blessed to have been able to see them all that time, and they just get a photograph. That was my thinking at the time.
And one of the things about the book that is really interesting, you've got a lot of rare pictures, a few that have never been seen anywhere else. Did you take pictures at the Cavern? A lot of them?
No, we didn't, Steve, because you didn't have the only time you took photographs in those days was if it was a special occasion, wedding or a special party, a special birthday. No, you just didn't carry a camera. I'm sorry that I didn't keep a diary, but you didn't. You just didn't do it.
And cameras were a lot bigger than they are now. You didn't have little cell phones now like they do, now. Yeah, what a shame. Did you ever record anything? Did you ever
No,
think about that? Oh my.
no, because it just didn't come into your head. You just went there to have a good time.
What were some of the songs you heard that we haven't heard on record or on the BBC? You mentioned a couple earlier that Pete sang. Were there other songs that you remember hearing that are kind of lost in the years?
George Harrison used to sing the Sheik of Araby, but he didn't call it the Sheik of Araby. He used to call it the Sheik of Wavertree because Wavertree was where he came from. So
Wow.
when he sang that, that's what he used to say. But generally, they just played the usual songs. Till There Was You, Paul would sing. The ones that we were very familiar with at the time, and it was the rock and roll that got the kids going.
What was the magic of the cavern? Was it the people? Was it the tight quarters? What was it?
I think it was a combination of things. You couldn't wait to go in there to get a piece of the action. If you were waiting near the cavern doorway up on the road level, because it was in the cellar basement, you could feel the throb underneath your feet. It sounded, and the beat of the drums, it sounded like a huge heart beating underneath your feet. It was an absolute amazing place, and we couldn't wait to get in and get a piece of the action. You'd go into a small doorway which was no more than about 4 feet wide, and there'd be a sort of an 8 to 10 feet walkway in, and then you'd go down 14 stone steps, steep steps, with a handrail on the left. And they're quite slippery too. And there was a little landing at the bottom, and then you'd turn to the left and there'd be 4 more steps down. And when you got into took you into the cavern proper, where there was a pay desk, which was just a little wooden desk and 2 wooden chairs where the guys would take your money. But when you entered that piece of the cavern at the bottom, it would send your senses reeling. It was so hot and so loud with the music, and we couldn't wait to get in and get a piece of the action. It just enveloped you. It was like an injection of pure joy. You just wanted to get in there and get some of it. It was just amazing.
Is it different today? Is the current cavern pretty much the same as it was, or have they changed it a lot?
It's a very good replica. It really is. I was
Okay.
there. I was there this afternoon as well. It's a very good replica. All the original bricks have built it,
Hmm.
and the dimensions are the same. The only thing that I find different is the headroom on the stage was a lot higher in the original Cavern. And of course, for me, it's inevitable that I'm going to think in my mind about the original as well as the replica when I'm in it, although it does bring back a lot of memories. So it's an excellent replica. And thank goodness we've got it. We could have ended up with nothing.
Yeah, that's true. What happened in the old days when it rained? Did the water go down the steps? No?
No, we didn't suffer with anything like that. But the cavern, I don't know whether you're aware of the infamous smell of the cavern. It had a peculiar smell, which was a combination of things. It was a combination of condensation smell that ran down, dripped down the walls. Consequently, that's why the fuses were always blowing and the lights were fusing. And smokes, because people smoked in those days, and perspiration from overheated regulars, because it wasn't the cool thing to do to take your coat off. So everybody suffered in their coats. You'd get the smell of disinfectant from the toilets, which were topped up every day because there were no main drains in the cavern. It was just a cesspit underneath, although we didn't know that at that stage. You'd have the smell of hot dogs and soup from the little cafe in the front, and the smell of rotting fruit would drift in from the fruit exchange across the road. So it was a combination of all those things. And when you went home, you took the smell with you. So if you went on the bus home, people would go, "She's been to the cavern." Everybody knew that's it. That's what it was. You couldn't get away from it.
Oh, that's amazing. You have a story near the end of the book that I think it was
the doorman, Paddy Delaney.
that said this. In 1969, Bill Clinton helped subdue a German guy who was about to attack Ringo. Do I have that correct?
That's what Paddy told us. That was his recollection of the time. I wasn't privy to that particular
Right.
meeting, but yes, that's what Paddy said.
Who's the most memorable group you saw at the Cavern besides the Beatles?
I would have to say that it was the big three,
The big three?
because they were the closest to the Beatles in dynamism. Dynamism, they were loud. Their energy was palpable, but it wasn't as exciting as the Beatles. The Beatles had the edge on them, and there were only three of them, and there was only one or two. Sometimes one would vocalize, and maybe the other one occasionally, but they didn't have that excitement that the Beatles had. But from a musical point of view, they came close to the Beatles. But we had about 300 groups in Liverpool at the time.
I'm going to give you a list of names and give some recollections. And I'm going to start with Bob Wooler. The anniversary of his passing was just yesterday. Was it yesterday? Talk about Bob Wooler, first of all.
Bob Wooler was wonderful with words, and he was given the microphone one night from Johnny Hutch from the Big Three to say a few words. And he said, "Remember, all you cave dwellers, the cavern is the best of cellars." And because of that's why Ray McFall engaged him as a disc jockey. And so he became the resident DJ at the cavern. And he was clever with a play on words. And he would introduce the groups like the Big Three, that we've got the hi-fi high and the lights down low. So here we go with the Big Three show. And he was clever, and he kept everything together. And he was the one that used to engage all the groups, book all the groups to come to the cavern. And he was a great guy, Bob. He and my dad got on very well together.
How about Paddy Delaney then?
He was another nice guy too. Paddy was a gentle giant. He was very respectful, fastidious about his appearance, but he could smell somebody dodgy from a good distance away. So he knew before they arrived at the main entrance that they weren't coming in. So yeah, Paddy was a lovely guy, very respectful. He used to call my father Chief.
Okay. Cilla Black.
I didn't know Cilla personally. I knew her from the cloakroom in the cavern. And I knew her because she used to get on stage. She'd sing with the Beatles, would back her, and the Foremost would back her as well. and she'd sing things like Fever or Summertime. Paul McCartney used to say, Paul McCartney used to call her Cyril, and he'd say, "Come on, Cyril, give us a song," and she'd get up with them. So
She was
that
she
she
was
was
she
on.
singing it? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Sorry, she used to work on the cloakroom in the Cavern,
Right.
but because she had a good voice and she was a great singer, they used to ask her to come up and sing a few songs.
With the Beatles? Did
They
she
would,
sing with? They
yeah,
would back her.
they would back her, and the Foremost would back her.
Was she singing any Lennon and McCartney songs then?
No,
No. Okay. Jerry Marsden, who I had the pleasure of meeting twice, and he was a delightful guy. But what did you think of Jerry?
oh, I loved him. He was a great guy, always smiling. It was infectious. You couldn't help smiling when you saw Jerry. He was fabulous. And another good group, a fabulous group. We were so well blessed in Liverpool to have such wonderful music and such great groups. We were spoiled.
Okay. Billy J. Kramer.
Yes, Billy J. Kramer, another great group. I saw Billy on Friday as an event here in Liverpool, and it was John Lennon that gave him the J. They were called Billy Kramer, and he said, "Stick a J in there, it sounds better." Little things like that. But yes, they were a fabulous group, wonderful songs and wonderful music. Fantastic.
One of the groups I noticed was mentioned quite a few times in the book is the Hollies.
Yeah.
And do you have anything to say about Graham Nash?
No, we didn't really know the Hollies that well because they weren't Liverpool. I suppose we knew more from the Liverpool groups like the Searchers and the Undertakers and the Rory Storm and the Hurricanes and hundreds of groups we had. But the Hollies did play the Cavern quite a number of times.
Since you mentioned the Searchers, I'm a big fan of the Searchers. I love their music. Do you have anything to say about them?
Fabulous group, fabulous group. Again, their music was different to the Beatles, but it was fantastic music, and we embraced all genres of music at the Cavern, whoever the group was. That it was such an exciting place. It was as if you'd stepped into another world when you entered the Cavern.
How you already talked about George and Ringo, and it's interesting when you talk about the alliance that the two of them had. They really had an alliance all the way through the Beatles. And even now, when Ringo has talked about George, there's that one clip in the anthology where he tears up. I mean, there was really a closeness there. And I always thought that given the alliance that John and Paul had, George and Ringo did that on their own because they really needed each other. But you did have some contact with Paul because you have pictures of Paul and Linda in the book.
Paul came to the Cavern unannounced one day in 25th of October, 68. I was at the hairdresser's. My father was stocking the top bar. We called it the top bar because we had to move the entrance from number 10, which was the Cavern proper, to number 8 because we adhere to all sorts of regulations that Liverpool Corporation demanded before we could reopen. So we had a larger entrance at number 8, and the doors were always open at the club all day long. I was at the hairdresser's. Paul walks in, and my father puts his hand out to shake his hand, said Alf Gagan, the Cavern, and Paul said Paul McCartney, the Cavern. And he said, "Alf, I've got my new girlfriend outside in the car, and I'd like to show her where it all began." But he said, "I can't come in right now. I'd like to come back in about an hour, if that's okay, on one condition." And my dad said, "What is it?" He said, "That you don't bring the press in." And my dad said, "You've got it." So he said, "Okay, I'll see you later." Now, we didn't know. I was at the hairdresser's, came back, and my dad said, "We've had a visitor." We had visitors all day long streaming through the Cavern. I said, "Who was it?" He said, "Paul McCartney." Oh, I said, "Have I missed him?" He said, "No, don't worry. There's a chance that he might come back. You put the champagne on ice," he said, "and finish stocking the bar. I'm going to go and buy a camera." So he went to a photographer's shop just off Dale Street, which is a couple of blocks away from the Cavern. He bought a Yashica camera and brought the photographer back with him, told the photographer that he wanted the camera setting for the lighting in the Cavern to take photos of a group that he managed, which was the truth. The group were there, but they were down in the cavern proper. So I saw to the bar. Dad came back with the photographer, and he said, now don't touch it. He set all the apertures on the front of the camera. He said, don't do anything. All you got to do is press the button. So we waited. And sure enough, in walks Paul with Linda. So we closed the doors to stop the tourists coming in, and we gathered in the top bar. And we started, Paul wanted to talk about and reminisce about the early days in the cavern of when they started, because that was the magic for them. That was when they were able to be themselves, when they were on the stage in the cavern. And John always said that he was at his happiest when he was on the cavern stage. And so Paul and I were talking about the early days. My dad went to pour champagne, and Linda said, I'll do that. I'm a good bartender. So she commandeered the champagne. And we talked some more, and my dad said to Paul, would you mind if we took some photographs for our personal use? And he said, oh, no, that's fine. Linda, I'll do that. I'm a good photographer. Picks the camera up, turns all the dials on the front, and my father's face was an absolute study, because we didn't know who she was. We didn't know she was a photographer. So my father I could see he was thinking, well, that's torn it. But however, we continued to talk. There were just 5 of us in the top bar. My dad, myself, Paddy Delaney. My dad had rung Paddy and said, get yourself down here. You won't regret it. I can't tell you what it's about. So just the 5 of us, and Linda and Paul. And Paul was telling us that he'd written a song for the film, The Magic Christian, called Come and Get It, for the Ivies. Now, the Ivies were like one of the family to us. My dad and Bill Collins, their manager, were good friends. And my dad gave the Ivies regular gigs at the Cavern. They came from South Wales. And when they'd finished their gigs at the Cavern, my dad would take them home to our house in Greenbank Road. He'd give them fish and chips to eat, or whatever they wanted, and a bed for the night, albeit on a sofa or a settee or whatever. And one night they had an extra guy with them that needed feeding and a bed for the night, and that was Chris Christopherson. So occasionally they'd have somebody with them. And so we always accommodated them. So we knew them very well, and they were lovely, respectful guys, all of them. And so we were talking about the Ivies and the Come and Get It song. And Paul said to my dad, I'm thinking of changing their name, Alf, he said. I'm thinking of calling them Finger. And my dad said, oh, don't like that, Paul, that's bad. And he said, Badfinger. Thanks, Alf. And that's how Badfinger got their name. And
that's a great story.
I was telling Joey Molland, I saw Joey Molland in New Jersey a couple of years ago, and I gave him the book, and I was reminiscing with him, and I explained, and he said, I'm so glad you've told me that story. He said, because I never did buy that story that was out there for Badfinger. And then we went from there, we went down into the cavern proper, and we'd had to build a huge staircase taking us right down into the cellar. And the group that my father managed, called the Curiosity Shop, were on stage. And Paul gets down into the cellar and shouts, all right, lads. And they were stunned to see him. And then what happened next, Steve, will live with me forever. The upright piano was outside the band room to the left of the stage. And Paul walked over to the piano and he started to sing and play Hey Jude. And it was so surreal. It was as if it was all taking place in slow motion. And wow. Even now, I get tingles thinking about it. Every time I hear Hey Jude, I'm transported back to that special moment. This was in October, and it had only been recorded in August, at the end of July, and Trident Studios in London. And then it had been aired on the David Frost show on the 8th of September. So this was only literally a month and a half after that. So we were probably one of the first public audiences to hear him sing and play Hey Jude. Certainly the only ones to hear him play it in the original Cavern anyway. And then he got on the stage, went through the band room, got on the stage, took his place on the drums. He always said he was a frustrated drummer. And Linda took more photographs. And then soon it was time for them to go. And my father gave Paul a red T-shirt with the Cavern logo on the front to go home with. And off they went down Matthew Street. And my dad and I then raced down to another little photographer's in Matthew Street called Jason's with the camera. And we said, we've got some sensitive film here. Could we stay in the dark room, please, for the development? And they said, yes, that no problem. And of course, they all turned out, didn't they? She was right. She was a good photographer, but we didn't have a clue.
And how about John Lennon? Do you have any John Lennon stories you can tell?
Not really, because John was a very deep soul. He kept himself to himself. I think we only found out how vulnerable John was after the event, didn't we? Because he could be quite sharp with people, quite cutting, not necessarily with the audience, with the group, etc. Sometimes would be, or with other group leaders or vocalists, etc., that they knew each other. But he could be quite cutting in his remarks, John. But that was his defense mechanism. And we've learned this since. We didn't know at the time. And he had big horn-rimmed glasses that he wouldn't wear, John wouldn't wear them because it didn't want to detract from the girls. But he had myopia, so he couldn't see past the first row of seats in the Cavern. So that was a barrier for him as well. He was always on, I suppose, with this defense mechanism that he always had that sort of a barrier between him and everybody else.
What movie about the Beatles that you have seen comes closest to the way you remember them? Like Backbeat, any of those? Nowhere Boy. Did any of those come close to?
No, I think that The Hard Day's Night was the one that the actual film, The Hard Day's Night, was closest to what we knew about the Beatles, where they were messing around and they were full of antics and quips and jokes. And that's the sort of Beatles that we knew.
Okay, because a lot of that was obviously fiction with the grandfather and all that stuff. But the way they portrayed themselves was fairly close to the real thing.
Yes, in that particular film, yes, definitely, where they'd lark about and mess around, and that because that's what they were like at the Cavern.
Interesting, interesting. Debbie, this has been really a joy to talk to you. I could sit here and talk to you for hours about everything that went on in those days. Are you going to do another book?
I'm in the process of a second edition. I was two-thirds the way through it when sadly my late husband, took bad. He took ill and passed away in December 23. And so I haven't had the drive to revisit it yet, but it's coming back to me now, and I'm hoping to get started on it again, because when my book was accepted by my publisher, it happened so quickly that I didn't put everything in that I could have done, because I said to my husband at the time, I could have put this in, and why didn't I put that in? And I forgot to put, I could have done this, and I could have done, and he said, you didn't have time to put it in. So now that I'm doing the new edition, I've added a lot more anecdotes and happenings, and also a lot more photographs. It'll happen
Do you
eventually.
have, do you know roughly when it's going to happen, or is it still a ways off?
Still a way off. I don't think it'll be this year, but it will probably be next year.
Okay.
It might be before Christmas. I don't know this year, but if not, it will be next year.
Best of luck with that. It would be great to have more stories from that period. It really would. Really would. Where can people get your book? I know it's on Amazon in both the US and UK. Is there any kind of a direct offer where they can buy it directly from you and maybe get special versions or special or autographs or things like that?
Yes, absolutely. This is my book,
Yes,
Cavern
I
Club.
I, I meant to put that up. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm glad you did.
Cavern Club, The Inside Story. It's available on Amazon worldwide. If you're in the States, it's in Barnes and Noble. If you're in the UK, it's in Waterstones. It's in all the Beatles outlets in Liverpool. And it's also, if you want a copy direct from me, dedicated, or it comes from thebeatlesbookstore.com. And that will come direct from me in Liverpool to wherever
Okay.
you.
Okay. All right, beautiful. Thank you, Debbie, very much. Best of luck with the new book. Best of luck with this one. I hope this interview helps some to get people to know about it and to buy it. And all the best to you. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, Steve. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, and as I usually do, I'm going to fumble around and stop the recording. Bingo. There we go. And now, here are some Beatles News Briefs. The Beatles traveled the world with cameras, and two of them, Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney, have published photo books with what they've done. The photos feature the Beatles on tour during the days of Beatlemania. Olivia Harrison announced this week that we're now getting one from George Harrison called The Third Eye on October 6th. The new book has over 200 photos, many published for the first time, taken by Harrison and laced with his wit. Besides the over 200 photos, the book has a running commentary on the pictures with quotes from Harrison never before seen, plus essays by Olivia Harrison and writers Colm Toibin and George Saunders. The book description indicates George's photos, besides featuring his fellow Beatles, includes friends and entourage during the Beatlemania days and were taken all around the world. We have a link where you can order it in our Beatles News and Information page and also on our That's What I Want Beatles page, both on Facebook. This is our review of Billy Preston, That's the Way God Planned It. Billy Preston, That's the Way God Planned It is at times a joyful and at times a sad look at the life and music of Billy Preston. Preston was known for the gospel spirit he brought to his music. That comes as no surprise when the movie reveals his gospel roots in the beginning. His movie debut in 1958's St. Louis Blues, which starred Nat King Cole, Eartha Kitt, Pearl Bailey, Cab Calloway, and Mahalia Jackson, talk about a lineup, featured 11-year-old Billy Preston playing gospel-tinged music on a church organ and showing what the world would come to know years later. The movie also tells that his first meeting with the Beatles wasn't during the Let It Be sessions in 1970, but in Hamburg, Germany, when the up-and-coming Beatles were performing night after night at the Star Club. We did 2 weeks at the Star Club when I got a real chance to hang out with the Beatles, Preston says in the film. I watched them on the side of the stage. They were my favorite. Preston says he carried word about the Beatles back home with him. I came back telling everybody about the Beatles, he said. Ringo Starr says, just joined the Beatles and we went to play in Germany opening for Little Richard. We loved him. And there was this kid playing keyboards. That's when we first met him. Olivia Harrison, George Harrison's widow and one of the film's two executive producers, says George said you couldn't even see his head over the keyboard, and he was amazing. Another one of the executive producers, by the way, is Jonathan Clyde, whose many Beatle-related projects included acting as executive producer for the Beatles' 8 Days a Week, the Touring Years film, and producing the Beatles film Get Back. Film reveals that Preston had a hidden side as a gay man who had been sexually abused as a youngster. Raised deeply religious, it was hard for him to play the upbeat music he loved and also be gay, according to the film. And the film says he didn't accept that until just before he died. Director Paris Barclay said he wanted to make this film, quote, because Billy Preston's life is not only musically significant, but emotionally urgent. His genius influenced some of the greatest artists of our time, yet his private struggles remained largely unseen. Those struggles are a major part of the film, and it unfortunately does little to provide answers, but at least his music is glorified here. The film opens with the musical rendition of That's the Way God Planned It that was so memorable from the concert for Bangladesh, when he broke away from the organ and danced playfully across the stage. Author David Ritz says when he performed, quote, he was in a state of bliss. And his work with the Beatles was not just a small moment in the film. There's footage from the tense Let It Be recording sessions and the Beatles rooftop concert, some of it likely taken from the Get Back film. John Lennon is heard commenting that Preston might be the fifth Beatle. Recording engineer Glenn John said later, "He made the situation 9,000,000% better." There were several other great musical moments in the film. These include the duet of Norah Jones and Ray Charles on Here We Go Again, which won Record of the Year in 2005, and on which Billy played organ. There was also a tour with the Rolling Stones, his move to A&M Records from Apple, which brought him the #1 hit Out of Space, which was the first in a string of songs for the label that got strong radio airplay, and also a tremendous live version of You Are So Beautiful, a song written by Billy Preston and here sung by Joe Cocker and Patti LaBelle. And those are just a few of the great moments in the film. In the later years of his life, Preston battled drug addiction and worked to get clean. He got help from Eric Clapton, but Preston was also arrested for insurance fraud and was accused of sexually abusing a 16-year-old boy. As the film nears its close, one of his friends says, "How did we let this boy get away from us?" It's one of many questions that the film asks, but unfortunately it cannot answer. Billy Preston, That's the Way God Planned It, is now playing in select theaters. Just a short note to let you know that Billy Preston, That's the Way God Planned It, will be screened in various theaters in the U.S. through June. You can find the showtimes at www.billyprestonfilm.com. Just wanted to make some comments about Evolver 62, the Mark Lewison film that's now on the internet for purchase and rent. It's an 108-minute film directed by Chris Purcell, a lecture that Lewison did. And in it, Lewison discusses why the year 1962 was such an important year for the Beatles. There are several things, big things that happened that year. One was that they changed from leather jackets to suits, which Lewison reveals was their decision, not Brian Epstein's decision. And there are other really interesting new revelations that he tells in the film. It's a great film. It's available on digital. It's on DVD and Blu-ray, but both of those are a little more expensive. But it is on digital for a very good price. And I would say definitely get it. It's well worth seeing. Here's a review of Paul McCartney's film Man on the Run. Paul McCartney's Man on the Run, which starts streaming on Amazon Prime worldwide on February 27th, is one of 3 McCartney legacy projects that have been offered to McCartney fans recently. There was Wings, a 32-track compilation curated by McCartney and released on CD, vinyl, and Blu-ray disc, and a hefty 550-page book about Wings called Paul McCartney Wings, The Story of a Band on the Run, edited by Ted Widmer. And that doesn't count the book, The Lyrics 1958 to Present, which was released in 2021. And though it's not a McCartney product, the first 2 volumes of The McCartney Legacy by Alan Kozin and Adrian Sinclair that are now available also go inside the Wings years, but they extend the story to 1980. Why has McCartney all of a sudden seen it necessary to recount so much of his past? One wonders if the McCartney Legacy, the first volume of which came out in 2022, followed by the second in 2024, might have inspired him just a little, but either way, there has been a wealth of historical information for McCartney fans to latch on to lately. Man on the Run is a homemade documentary of Paul's run-up to and life with Wings, directed by Morgan Neville. Much of the film is in McCartney's own words about the end of the Beatles and what a challenge it was to go on to Wings. but it also includes comments from Linda McCartney, members of Wings, including Denny Lane, Denny Sywell, and Lawrence Juber, and his daughters, Mary and Stella McCartney, as well as others, including Sean Ono Lennon and Mick Jagger. There's footage of Paul and the family at home, Paul and Wings on the road, and in the studio. The pressure that Linda McCartney felt she was under as a member of the band, the making of Band on the Run, and his contact with John Lennon during this time. Some of the revelations are quite interesting, including Paul's personal conflict as the Beatles ended, Denny Sidewell and Denny Lane on the beginnings of Wings, the trip to Lagos for Band on the Run, the Saturday Night Live Beatles reunion offer, and much more. There's a lot here to enjoy. Coming after the voluminous Paul McCartney Wings, a story of a band on the run, though, 13 hours if you buy the audio version, which we really recommend, it seems to fall short. On one hand, Man on the Run doesn't feature voices of anyone who wasn't in the film. In other words, everybody seen in the film is their own voice. But the audiobook only features Mary and Stella McCartney plus a long 20-minute plus introduction by Paul himself. The rest of the book is read by someone else. Still, the book goes much deeper into the thoughts and words of everyone involved in the story. Maybe it would have been better to release the film first, then the Wings book, with the compilation in between. Maybe it would have told the story much better, but anything that adds to the story is good, especially when it comes from the man himself. Years from now, we'll treasure this one even more.
Thanks very much for listening to our podcast today. If you enjoyed our program, we'd really appreciate a positive review at the place where you get your podcasts. Apple and Google love positive reviews, and it really helps us. If you don't already, please subscribe to our show so you'll get our newest shows right away. We have some great shows coming up, and we would also love to hear your suggestions for the show. So please write to us at BeatlesNewsBriefs@gmail.com or catch us online on Facebook in our Beatles News and Information group. If you've missed any of our past shows, you can hear all the audio versions at marinucci.podbean.com, or you can find both the audio and video versions at BeatlesNewsBriefs.blogspot.com. And please tell your friends about us. We appreciate you all for listening. Now here again is your host, Steve Marinucci.
Well, that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. You can hear our complete list of shows at marinucci.podbean.com in audio and in video and audio at youtube.com. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. We would love to have you, and you'd find out about the shows as soon as they're published. Again, thanks for supporting us, and take care, everybody, and until next time, we'll be seeing you.
Be seeing you.
What a show! What a show! Oh, wonderful, wonderful.